Hello and welcome. I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads for you all, this time covering Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. This cover is the 20th anniversary edition from 2005. The original was published in 1985. And there's a little kind of historical introduction at the beginning in this one that talks about a number of the kind of things going on in 1985 that are mentioned, including a number of the kind of proper nouns that have no longer the same kind of cultural relevancy as they did then. Almost like a fantasy glossary in the back or something like that. It's funny. A lot of the material of this book makes use of those kind of various TV show hosts, late night hosts, and televangelists who I didn't recognize their names. But then also discussion of some of the political things going on, obviously in 1985 during the second Reagan administration. All a sort of material in order to help someone like myself situate the historical context for a book that is, I think, designed to explicate some kind of timeless ideas, but also is very much wrapped up in the material of its period, which I guess the reader will have to decide how they feel about that. For me, I could have used more of the timeless and less of the specific references to the 80s, but I suspect it made for a more successful book at the very least at the moment it was published. So, Amusing Ourselves to Death is a book that sets forward a thesis that essentially has to do with the nature of a dominant media, a shift in the dominant systems of media and communication, and especially of news, of larger kind of cultural discussion, all of this stuff. And the argument goes essentially that there is a major shift that by 1985 has already taken place. That is the shift from a specific form of written media, and that is typographic media. That is material that is not copied out by handwriting, but is made possible through the invention of a printing press with movable type in order to create these immense amounts of written material made out of letters, and that through a number of technological advancements, this begins to change in some specific ways. The telegraph and the photograph start to change the nature of print media. And then eventually, this transformation is further driven as you have broadcasted radio. And then finally, the sort of dominant media becomes television. And that television in America becomes the dominant structure of any type of media consumption. And more particularly, that even though television media has not killed off the radio or print media or anything like that, it has successfully transformed expectations of media in a way that has altered those more venerable forms of media production and consumption, and has essentially caused this major transformation of the nature of expectations of all forms of kind of cultural interaction and societal development and all these different things, that Americans have been primed to expect the world to be a place of entertainment that is disjointed and incoherent and exists at its kind of core elements to capture the attention as much as anything else. And this comes from a number of, I guess you might say, sort of philosophical backgrounds that I thought were uh, fairly interesting, worth being interested in, even if you don't totally agree. And I guess I'm going to say here that I think the book is broadly worth reading. And I think it is pretty interesting. I don't think it is perfect, um, but worth reading and thinking about, even if you don't necessarily agree with the conclusions. And in particular, I'm going to say that because I think what I'm going to say for the rest of this discussion is basically all criticisms of the book. So I want to start by saying I don't think that the book is bad, but I do have a number of criticisms of it. And a lot of these have to do with, I think, both the kind of historical context and, in some ways, the nature of the conclusions of the book itself. Um, so there's a couple of points that I wanted to bring up, and let's start with some fairly, I guess, less controversial ones to start. One of the criticisms that is leveled in the book is towards the concept of educational television. This idea of television produced for young people that is designed to have some amount of educational content, and that this is a demeaning of the concept of education. This is essentially training young students or even pre-student age children, pre-K kids, to expect for education to be an entertainment rather than whatever else we might describe it as. And I think there is a reasonable version of that point. But I also think that Neil Postman does not totally seem to understand why a lot of that educational content is attractive. Especially, I think he seems to take the perspective that it would be better for TV to just remain entertainment, whereas a lot of the development of those kind of educational programs, and specifically Sesame Street, is talked about a fair bit in the book. So Sesame Street is a good example that Sesame Street exists, it seems to me, as much out of a recognition that young children are likely to spend a fair bit of time in front of the TV, independent of whether material is made specifically for them to be educated with that or not, and that it is more like a stopgap measure to try to create some educational value out of that experience, rather than totally brain rotting for the, whatever it is, average of 5 hours a day that the average American spent watching TV at the time, which I think is an unrecognized, unacknowledged element of that interaction, and it is, I think, very much presented as this is a problem because of the way that it creates expectations about education. It also, I think, he does not seem to believe in the idea of the relationship between entertainment and attention and learning. And it is a complicated issue because obviously learning itself can be quite difficult, and learning something deeply and intensely when it is a difficult subject, there's I think almost no way to completely eliminate that difficulty the same way as I would say, for instance, like a particularly dense philosophy book may not have a less dense version of it. There may be no way to write the material in a way that is not so dense because it is the material itself that demands this level of intellectual attention and engagement, almost independent of how it is presented. And I think that in that way, there it is true that there is a potential kind of cheapening of learning through the attempt to transform it into entertainment. But equally, we know pretty well by now, broadly speaking, about the value of attentive engagement with learning and the relationship between those kind of entertaining elements in order to further that type of attention and learning is not a myth. It is not a just some kind of advertiser's idea of what things ought to be like. It is true that students who are, entertained on some level by what they're doing, that are attentive to what they're doing, because of that, do learn better, basically, broadly speaking. Obviously, there's a lot of complexity when talking about that type of learning. And he uses a lot of examples of essentially the news watching public's reduced information, reduced ability to comprehend or analyze the information that they have been presented as a refutation of this concept. And I think it is not a successful refutation, essentially. Um, he also, I think, runs into a fairly serious issue when he is talking about this idea of a historical America that is dominated by printed, written material in comparison to a modern television dominated America. And he talks about, for example, the Lincoln Douglas debates and just how much talking there was in these debates, that in some cases, it presents the example of essentially 7 hours of debate, right? Talking, these two men talking to each other, presenting sophisticated arguments for extended periods of time, and the recognition that, frankly, the attention of modern Americans would not be held by this concept, but that at the time the attention was held by this, that people did listen to these debates in full and had opinions about the arguments and were paying attention and all that sort of stuff. And all of that, I think, is good and valuable, but it does run into what I think is the kind of obvious historical criticism, which is that this print dominated culture was not able to solve some of the most underlying and most critical issues of the day through a discussion dominated by the structures of print media. It could not end up using these immense and sophisticated debates to solve the core problem. And what happened was that almost a third of Americans became Confederates for a while, and fought a terribly devastating war over these issues, and specifically, all of these Confederates on some level fought to uphold holding human beings as slaves. And the obvious I think refutation to Neil Postman's point about all of the nature of America at this time is that clearly it did not make these people more moral or virtuous or better able to intellectually wrestle with the serious consequences of what their existence entailed if they were going to go on to fight on the pro-slavery side of the Civil War, right? That it seems like the most obvious refutation of, actually, were all of these people so much better at all these things, or did they just spend a whole lot more time talking about these things, that they were perhaps engaged with the discussion, but is that actually good when you're talking about, like a Confederate soldier engaged in this issue? And I think it is not a inconsequential argument, because one of the things that is, I think, fairly quickly glossed over in the introduction is the way that the immediacy of imagery and audio, the way that the immediacy of television taps into a stark moral position, and how that is tied to so many of the positive changes in the world of modernity, that the example used of like the civil rights movement, or of the protests against the Vietnam War, as being essentially a reflection of this moral immediacy that comes out of imagery that is not captured by this print typographic culture nearly in the same way. And in kind of a more recent example, I think about the way that it, as somebody cleverer than I has pointed out, the arguments in favor of the Israeli occupation of Palestine are in text, and the arguments in favor of the Palestinians being actively killed are imagery and videos, because those are immediate and powerful, and almost impossible to successfully argue in favor of a person or a people being treated in that way, with that kind of immediate media response, that the pathos of a picture of a person digging through rubble to try to find their family is almost unanswerable by a written argument, and that actually that is a good thing. It is actually good if this moral immediacy encourages us and pushes us to make the world a better place. And I think that is an argument that is essentially not really engaged with at all by Neil Postman's book. And I think it is not an inconsequential one to this discussion of the value of these types of media. And I think that also sort of ties in with the conclusion. Neil Postman's kind of final conclusion is, he talks about different ideas, and he says, well, one idea is that we could, get rid of TV, or at least create laws about limiting it. But I think that's not really reasonable. And what we should do instead is trust in education to help with this problem. And I think, if anything, he has demonstrated the particular emphasis on reasonableness instead of rightness as a feature of print media in a television dominated world. And that, if anything, I think I would be more interested in the book as a whole if he had ended with, "It's not reasonable, smash your TV," because that access to immediacy, and even if it is not reasonable, it is a important thing to I think recognize the difference between being reasonable and being right. And I think that I was thinking about, in comparison, what would something like Pascal Quignard's The Roving Shadows, how does it kind of conclude in this thing? Because it, in some ways, is about a very similar issue, a cultural transformation from the supremacy of the word to the supremacy of the image. And I think responds to this cultural issue, the decline of the power of the word, by crafting a beautiful piece of literature that is itself the power of the word, and is awesome, and is so good. And The Roving Shadows is a capital G great book, and I don't think Amusing Ourselves to Death is capital G great, even though I'm going to recommend that you read it and think about what it says yourself. So I guess that's my kind of final thoughts, is that Neil Postman doesn't want to say smash your TV, but here at Live from Pellam's Wasteland, we believe in smashing TVs. So that's that. Anyway, thank you so much for watching or listening. Leave a comment down below if you have a response, or if you've read Amusing Ourselves to Death, or if you're a big fan of Roger Waters' album that takes from the title of this one. Otherwise, I've been Live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.